So we had begun talking about the Enlightenment. We began with that yesterday, looking at some of the foundations of them, and that's what the bell ringer was about. Hopefully, you were able to get through the DBQ, finding the main idea and three pieces of evidence for each of those documents, and then answering the questions at the end. That, of course, also goes along with the Enlightenment. So today we'll continue with it by discussing, first of all, the two big themes: humanitarianism and toleration. And humanitarianism will look at justice and governance in particular. Justice and governance. And the guy on the picture there, the left hand side, would be Cesare Beccaria, which is spelled Cesare, Cesare, and Beccaria, Beccaria. Yes, Beccaria. And Cesare Beccaria wrote on crimes and punishment. On crimes and punishment. And in this book, he writes about power, reason, and human dignity. He did not like the idea that punishment in the justice system was about society's vengeance. He believed punishment, instead of being about vengeance, should be about rationale, about maintaining order and preventing future crimes. So he basically said if you're going to punish someone that is found guilty, it shouldn't be about exacting revenge. It should be about making sure it provides a symbol that we're not going to let anarchy rule. We're not going to let crimes just be committed. We're going to try to stop them from happening in the future. In his book, he also opposed torture and the death penalty. And these have been opposed by various groups throughout the years, especially in the guise of religion, but really it would be the first time it would be a major part of philosophy in the Enlightenment. And then there's religious toleration. We already discussed how there were a number of the Enlightenment thinkers who believed we should be more tolerant. That's one of the reasons why they respected England, even though England had its issues with Catholics and some groups. They still were more tolerant against dozens and dozens of different types of Christian denominations. And so many of the Enlightened thinkers were in favor of ending any type of religious persecution or warfare. It would be a mistake to say, though, that they were atheists. Although some probably were, the majority actually defined themselves, just like the founding fathers of the United States, many of them as deists, which is spelled Deists. A deist is someone who believes in an all-powerful being, a god, as what they refer to as a divine clockmaker. And the theory was, if you came across a clock, you wouldn't just assume that it was just there all by itself, that someone made it. And they said basically the universe is so complex, so there must be an all-powerful being that created it. But after this power created the universe, it basically has had a hands-off approach afterwards. So many of these deists, including some of our own founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, for instance, they didn't believe in miracles or things like that, or God intervening directly. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wrote a version of the Bible that stripped out all of Jesus' miracles because they didn't believe they were realistic. So they did believe in an all-powerful being, but not one that intervened. And one important religious figure would be the guy on the right, Moses Mendelssohn. Moses, and Mendelssohn is spelled Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn. He took up the idea of the question of Jewish identity. So, Jewish identity. In fact, he even wrote about what it means to be Jewish. And so he often wrote defending Jewish communities against anti-Semitic policies and help bring to the forefront their identity as a culture. Let's focus on economics, government, and administration. And of course, economics became a concern because of these growing empires and all of the resources and trade that was needed. So it made economics an important issue. And the first group of people to really study it would be the French physiocrats. Physiocrats is spelled Physiciocrats. That's Physiciocrats. The French physiocrats believed that mercantilism was misguided. Mercantilism. And mercantilism was the idea that each country its people should only buy from internally inside the own country. So English people should only buy English goods. But at the same time, English should try to sell as much as they can to Spain and Portugal and so on. The problem with that is it's incredibly flawed because obviously each country is going to try to do that. So no one is going to end up buying from each other. People aren't going to trade. Resources that are isolated aren't going to get to where they need to go. How did many countries enforce mercantilism? They did so with a tax on imports known as a tariff. So tariffs were often used to enforce this policy. Not only that, but they noted France, England, and other places, there are often monopolies granted, often to noble families, control over industry or resources, and they thought that was wrong. They believed that the land, through production, provided wealth. And so they wanted less government involvement and less government taxation. The policy of wanting less government in the economy is known as laissez-faire, which is spelled Laissez, Laissez dash F-A-I-R-E dash F-A-I-R-E. So that is less government in the economy. But it wasn't the French physiocrats that most focused and elaborated on this. It would be the guy on the screen there, Adam Smith, no relation. Adam Smith wrote a book, coincidentally in 1776, called The Wealth of Nations. That's the short title. Yes. What? It's supposed to be causes. Remember, at the time, F's and S's sometimes were switched. Fun fact. So he too believed that things like agriculture shouldn't be concentrated in the hands of just one entity or person. He believed that humans should be encouraged to engage in labor. Because when they did, they made goods and services in the interest of themselves, of course, to make money, but then they in turn provided those goods and services to the public. He also pointed out that often economic problems fix themselves. If someone is charging too much for a product, people will go somewhere else to buy it. If an employer isn't paying enough, no one will come work for them, so they'll have to pay more. He symbolized this method of letting problems fix themselves as the invisible hand. It was a metaphor for how the economy fixed itself. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It does look like hair, but I believe it is a hat, yes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau liked to debate with other philosophers, some would say purposely argue. He believed that humans were good, but he did attack certain things that existed within humanity, like privilege, especially for people like nobles. And he also believed that democracy, or letting the people have a greater voice, was important. In 1762, he wrote The Social Contract. In it, he writes, the only legitimate government is when the people, concerned about anarchy, about their rights being taken away, they form a government. And that government is meant to protect the people, particularly life, liberty, and property. If that government isn't doing that properly, if it's not protecting the people's rights, then the people have the right to change that government. So because the government only existed because of the people, he believed that the government should follow the general will of the people. And he believed that the people then, having a vested interest in being protected, should then contribute willingly to this government. And he also wrote the book Emile, which is the story of a boy's education. But he didn't necessarily believe early that education should be so rigid that education,
No.
Emile,
Yep.
Emile.
Emily.
Wow, this boy's name would be Emile. But anyway, he believed that education should be that rigid and that children should be allowed to explore and go outside and have imaginations. And the goal should be to give them some type of sense of morality and good citizenship. However, he also thought that women, of course, were useful only as mothers and wives.
Some people have phones.
And the opposite of that last opinion, of course, would be Mary Wollstonecraft. This might be a surprise, but she was one of Rousseau's greatest critics.
Really?
Yes.
Very sharp in the nose.
She believed that in a book she wrote called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Vindication of the Rights of Women.
She was a power.
Yeah. She said we should not only get rid of inequality when it comes to rank and status as a noble or not or a commoner, we should also get rid of it when it comes to gender as well.
That's a very bold statement in the 1700s.
Yes, it was. She pointed out that women have the ability to reason and could therefore also participate in government. She also wrote about the fact that the law was unequal when it came to the treatment of women, especially in marriage. And she thought that education should support liberty and self-reliance, which she pointed out was untrue for women at the time. Usually the only schooling that women had access to, especially the upper middle class and the upper class, was to make them better wives. And she's pointed out that has no value.
What was it?
Self-reliance.
What's this thing? The name's on there. You took it as a kid. No one had no taxes. What did you do? Too bad. Let's see. Gotta make a credit card. Okay.
And the last topic we'll just segue to here a little bit would be Enlightenment and 18th century culture. And the first thing I'll mention with Enlightenment and 18th century culture would be the book trade, otherwise known as print culture.
Culture.
Print culture,
What you said?
print culture,
What you said?
book trade, or print culture.
Okay. Newspaper.
Yes, also newspapers. There'd be explosive growth in daily newspapers.
A lot of people can read now. Sure.
Censorship was attempted, but that was circumvented, but it did make books more expensive in some cases. And it also led to a literary underground, books being traded back and forth between individuals outside of the scope of government.
Bootleggers.
Yes, book bootleggers.
Some very intelligent people.
Of course, the freest country was Britain, which was, compared to other nations, relatively free of restrictions.
What does that mean? Freedom is different from different people. Oh yeah, I asked, what's like the literacy rate? Like how many people can read at a time?
That's a good question.
Is it like much more than before? Like
It was significantly greater, but I don't know that it was a majority at this point.
40-30%.
So it did create a network of readers and also social institutions. Clubs would form basically to discuss, for instance, books.
9% can read.
Today, yes. And this would mostly be concentrated, of course, amongst cosmopolitan areas, cities, especially the high cultured. But it did link together nobles and the middle class. And that-
12%.
Learned societies were created, like the Society of Edinburgh, and some even in the colonies, like the American Philosophical Society. And we already mentioned before the Royal Society in London, for instance, amongst others. And in major cities, you would start to see meeting places where people would come together to discuss the Enlightenment, known as salons.
I remember that.
And also actual clubs, known as Masonic lodges.
That's a little different.
And you also see the creation in the private sector businesses like coffee houses, where people would stop by to drink coffee, but also discuss the thoughts of the day. It's greatly broadened what was known as the public sphere of influence. But of course, as it was just pointed out there, because of lower literacy rates and other things, it wasn't as expansive as people might have thought. Now, is it more expansive and impactful than the Renaissance? Yes. And encouraged the middle class to take up more than just special trades and business owning. It also encouraged bookkeeping, expanded knowledge of math and law. Middle class women were more encouraged toward education. Although, as Mary Wollstonecraft pointed out, that wasn't always necessarily the best form. And it also expanded the various types of literacies that were available. You could find books written that would be for both men and women, for instance, focused on life and stories of both rural and urban areas. And for people that didn't have a lot of money, it also expanded into cheaper books known as blue books, because their paperbacks was just simple blue paper. So go ahead and pause there for the today and finish that tomorrow. For the remainder of the period, you can have some time to finish up the DBQ if you didn't already, or any of the other activities that we worked on for this week for the 4th unit.